Today is March 20th, 1984. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Mr. John Burwell. Mr. Burwell, where were you born?
In Connecticut, Winsted, Connecticut. Little city outside of Hartford.
When's your birthday?
January 1, 1917.
1917. Who was your father?
Albert Lewis Burwell.
And who was your mother?
Getha.
Getha? And
She was a Wright.
Right. Were they both from Connecticut?
Yes.
What kind of work did your father do?
He was a chemist, industrial
chemist.
chemist.
And how long did you live in Winston?
We left and came to Oklahoma in 1921. I was 4 years old.
How come you came to Oklahoma?
Dad quit a good job with DuPont. Came out here with his brother and Cecil Demille.
Cecil Demille?
He was financing them on an oil venture in that Broken Arrow area up near Tulsa. And we lived in Broken Arrow.
Did you know Mr. Demille?
No. I never knew about it until after Dad died and I was cleaning out his desk. I found this letter from Mr. Demille that had been written in the 20s, telling Dad not to feel bad about going broke. Because I did. Because he said he'd been broke a lot of times. It was a funny letter. I wish I had it. I don't know what I did with it.
So Cecil B. Demille financed your father, and was it a whole company he financed, or what?
No, I think it was just an exploration venture. They drilled some wells. There were in that old field around Broken Arrow. They were all shallow. I've got all that's left of the company. It's a aneroid barometer that was used to walk out across pastures and the prairies hunting for highs. It would register about 2 foot of elevation change. It was a real good one. And a Brunton pocket transit. Those 2 instruments were what they used.
And that's all the stuff.
And that was all. See, there was no geology known then about. They would just hunt for these highs, and they were shallow wells, so that often there were little domes. You wouldn't see them, but you could walk across the prairie, and if you had these instruments, you could tell whether you were gaining a little altitude, you know. And they hit a few good ones, but then they hit 9 dry holes in a row, and that finished them.
So when did the company go bankrupt?
I don't know as it went bankrupt, they just quit.
They just quit. What was the name of the company?
I don't think they had one. It was just a partnership.
Between your father and Mr. Demille and who else?
And his brother, Harvey. Harvey was a Air Corps pilot. He'd, you know how he's a favorite uncle type, you know?
Yeah.
He was quite a young man. He was younger than Dad, very flamboyant. He used to fly in to see us. I think he was probably stationed. What was the field at Fort Worth? Military.
Oh. Yeah, that's still there. There's an Air Force base there. Is it not Carswell? Is it Carswell?
No. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Harvey became a general about Second World War. But he'd gone in the Air Force in 1914.
Did he fly over in Europe in the war?
I don't know whether he did or not. I never knew. But when he'd fly in to Oklahoma, he looked just like Snoopy with his, the Red Baron.
Yeah.
He'd have the white scarf and those fancy boots and military rig. We all thought he was something. We were very young.
Mm-hmm. Where'd you start school?
Where did I start? In Broken Arrow.
Broken Arrow.
Mm-hmm.
What, public school?
Mm-hmm.
How big is Broken Arrow when you moved there? What do you remember about the
Probably
town?
about maybe 1,500. Very small, 14 miles out of Tulsa on a mud road.
Was it many in Oil Town?
No, I don't believe it. It was see, it was close to the Arkansas River, so there was some farming and cattle, pasture land. A lot of that Osage country was mostly pasture. But it was they were still trying to farm some of that country.
Mm-hmm. When you moved to Broken Arrow, what kind of house did you live in?
Little frame house, 2 bedrooms.
And how long did this partnership last? How many years?
I think it must have broken up, or not, or they abandoned the venture in about 1925, I think, because we moved to for a year, maybe a year and a half, to Fort Worth. And Dad worked for some kind of a paper box company. I was too young. I was in the second. I was really ready for the 3rd grade. And and I remember they put me back in the 2nd because I came from Oklahoma. Texas had a real good school system. And they just didn't think anybody else was that good, so they put everybody out of state back.
Mm-hmm.
And it was good because that made me a little older than the other kids in the same grade. Then we came back to Broken Arrow, and in 1927 we moved up to south of Tulsa, just off Riverside Drive on the Arkansas. And we made our home there, and Dad worked in industrial chemistry again.
Who did he work for?
He had a job with a company owned by a man named Pogginsey. They made up chemicals for the water treating system there in Tulsa, and various oil companies, the specialized chemicals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Dad would buy the basic chemical and put them together to make a certain, let's say, cleaner.
Yeah.
So he made cleaners. He just made just about anything.
How did the Great Depression affect you and your family, the 30s?
Well, like everybody else, we had a pretty rough time, but I guess ours was different in that 1932, Dad and my older brother, went hunting, dove hunting, and my brother tripped over a fence with a gun, and Dad got shot in the leg. And he was hospitalized for 2 or 3 years. And so it was really rough on him. He couldn't work. He had a little insurance that helped. He had a lot of life insurance that as he just about lose a house, he'd cash another policy in. And somehow we didn't go under.
Mm-hmm. Did you do any work at this time in the Depression?
Did I?
Yeah.
Well, depends on when you consider the Depression years. I'd work in the summers.
I was looking at 1930, I guess, through up to World War II.
I'd worked, well, first I put in a garden. We had a couple of lots there, and it was big enough, and it was good sandy bottom land. I put in a garden with Dad, and then I peddled groceries. Peddled fruit, vegetables mostly. In that whole area along Peoria. I had a regular route, and I made good money, really.
Were you all caught up in the bank failure?
No. I don't think we had enough in the bank to have any problems. Then I worked for the park department. Summers, I took care of the Woodward Rose Garden. I was the rose horticulturist, I guess. I was in high school.
You say you worked for the park department. What'd you do for them?
I took care of that Woodward Rose Garden.
Oh, that was...
And the park.
Is that city park or state park?
It's a city park.
City park.
I worked every summer.
Who was head of the city parks in Tulsa?
I'm trying to think. He was a fine old man. He's one of the reasons that Tulsa has a pretty nice park department. He was a city planner. I think he came from up Minnesota. And Minneapolis was noted for having a planned city. I'll think of that man's name maybe sooner or later. I think they have a park named after him up there. But I trimmed trees along the parkways.
So you all survived the Depression pretty good then?
Oh, I think, yeah, compared with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I got 27 cents an hour. And that was good. I saved enough to get through school.
What were your main duties in the Woodward Rose Garden? What'd you do?
Well, I took care of them at night, mostly, because that's when we'd water and apply the fungicides. We had, I think, 1,500 varieties. It was probably the biggest rose garden in the country at the time.
Now, is the Woodward Rose Garden the Tulsa Rose Garden now? Is that the same thing?
I don't know. I don't know what its official name is. It's right next to the big museum.
Philbrook?
Philbrook.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. It was right next door. The mansion of Phillips.
Okay, it's in the same area then.
Yeah. And that, now, last time I was there, they looked like they almost combined, because that museum had greenhouses and was raising stuff, and I don't know whether they were commingling or just what. But
Well, I think
I was looking at some of the roses, all right, but some of the trees we'd planted. We'd planted a lot of trees there on that. We had them from the west, the Douglas fir, and Austrian pine, and the black pines. It was kind of an attempt to see what would grow there, and those things had grown until they were saw logs. They're enormous trees now.
So most of the trees grew there then?
Yeah. Tulsa is funny. It's kind of a fringe area between the Ozarks and the west, and the prairies, and I don't know what it is about Tulsa, but you could grow a lot of things there. You could grow blue spruce, and, the Colorado stuff. It never, of course, would grow like it did in its native area, but this old man that was head of the park department was interested to see what could be done. Cypress, we had some ball cypress. First time I ever seen these species,
It's my understanding there at Will Rogers Park in Oklahoma City they did that. They took a big area to see which trees would grow, and they all grew.
Yeah. I found last time I was up there, I have a son who's a forester, works for the state. Division of Forestry. There's a Midwest city, and we went to a nursery up there, and I found a Dawn cypress that I bought and brought down here because the young man who is the state's urban forester, they have 2, I think, now. They ought to have more. He said he was finding those growing pretty well in Oklahoma City. And this particular nursery was growing them from their own seed, apparently. You know, bringing them up for 2 or 3 years and then potting them and selling them, and they were doing. And the one that I brought down here, I gave to an old lady who was a babysitter for years when the kids were little. And she loves those kind of things, and she's got it growing. It survived the winter, this bad winter.
Oh, that's good. When did you get out of high school? What year?
1935.
1935.
In Tulsa Central, which is now the Public Service Company office in Tulsa. Remember they restored it?
Yeah.
At least they restored the outside of it. It looks just like it did. They've done things inside. Everybody I talked to that's ever worked in there says it's beautiful. And it's a very nice place to work.
Yeah, that's good. Did you go to college then?
Yes. Went to Stillwater, A&M, for 2 years, starting in 35.
Did you live on campus or off campus?
I lived on campus. Well, off campus first. First year, several of us, old buddies from high school, went up there, and we got a room in a rooming house, just off campus. And later, I joined a fraternity.
Which one?
SAE.
SAE. Okay.
And Dad helped me with a curriculum in forestry, which they didn't have at Stillwater. But we weren't financially able to do anything else but try to get 2 years, and then I would transfer. And he found that the University of Michigan was on a semester system, just like Oklahoma's college universities. Wrote and got their book on requirements for the first 2 years there, and I copied them at Stillwater. I was in the School of Business, School of Agriculture, School of Engineering, Arts and Science, and they didn't know what to do with it, but they let me do it. And when I transferred in 1937, I didn't lose an hour.
That's good.
I didn't lose an hour.
So you
Dad had done a
transferred-
good job of planning.
So you transferred to Michigan.
Ann Arbor.
Yeah. How big was A&M? How many students at that
It
time?
was about around 3,500, 4,000.
That's before the big expansion under Bennett, wasn't it?
Well, Bennett was there,
It was there.
but things started things started expanding after 1945.
I guess the main buildings then, Old Central, Old Williams.
Yeah, Williams Hall, and of course there were several of the old buildings then, but it was a very barren campus. It was typical prairie, and they've turned it into a formal campus pretty much by bringing
Have you
in.
been back to Old Central?
Yeah.
What do you think of it?
Oh, I loved it. I just think it's. I'm glad they tried to restore it.
You think that's a good restoration?
Well, I tell you, it looks like it looked to me when I first went there. Of course, it was old then,
Yeah.
and there were some classes being held in it. But I remember a talk then that it was maybe getting unsafe.
I went to school there in '64. It was still unsafe. I
Did
had
you?
classes in '64.
Yeah. Oh, good. Here's some coffee.
Oh.
We lucked into her.
Mm-hmm.
Very impersonable lady.
Yeah.
When did you go? 64?
60.
The measurements required
Mm-hmm.
in forestry, especially inventory,
Yeah.
and you learn to pace, you know,
That's right.
and maybe use the sun or your watch or anything else that was handy to get direction and declination and all these things. And I never do anything used to in the woods that I didn't map,
Mm-hmm.
because I just partly for the hell of it. Have you ever read, I'm sure you have, Hannes's old geology of Oklahoma,
Yeah.
especially the southeastern Oklahoma, especially the second part of it, where it's more geography than economic geography. That I read that about once a year, and it'll tell me things that I've seen that I didn't know anybody else had seen. You know, I almost fell in a mine, an old mine shaft one day up on Buffalo. I was running a compass line and making plots and measuring it. And I stopped just in time to keep from falling in that pit. That thing was maybe 20 feet across. And I played around there trying to find out how deep it was. I didn't have enough string to ever tell.
Good.
But there was still spoil banks
Yeah.
there. And I went to Hannes, and sure enough, he had under his paragraph or so of mines, he described it, had a picture of it with the shaft. Well, in 1919, some of the old shafting was, wooden timbers were still there. But when I was there, it must have been in 49 maybe, or 50. All that was gone. But what I liked about him is he described everything he found as being so many paces on a bearing east or something from a corner. Because all those old corners were still there then, the section corners that were done in 1898.
Right.
And I found many of them. They're still there. If
Yeah.
somebody hadn't clear cut and destroyed them. Was it tallywhacker? You know, the little instrument that you push and it just count for you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd carry that in this hand every time I swing. I'd just punch it. But mostly like you, I always count. So I know how many chains I've gone.
Yeah.
And I always know how far I am from the car now. That's the main thing with me is I don't want to go too far because I'm getting too old to get back to the car.
Well, you transferred to Michigan in 1937. And, did you know Dr. Bennett at A&M?
I just knew him, that's all. He had a daughter in the school at the time, as I recall. She was quite a good student. And I knew her slightly, but not. See, only 2 years. You just don't. You miss an awful lot by transferring.
Mm-hmm.
If you go 4 years with the same people, you get to know everybody.
Right. How big was Michigan?
It was about 10,000 at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, like going from A&M up there, I expected a lot of things. Michigan was an old school. The Forestry School was established, I believe, in 1907. And I expected to really have to work hard to make grades. But one thing I found out was that the basic education I got at Stillwater, in many cases, was better than in that Big Ten school. For instance, mathematics, the trigonometry and the geometry and all these geology. And the thing that I remember got me was I found out what the pay scale on the professors, beginning teachers, and they were a full professorship, for instance, at Stillwater in 1935-36 was about $3,500 a year, and it was about $7 at Ann Arbor. $7,500. You know, those guys. I remember when I thought if I could make $5,000 a year, I'd be rich.
Yeah.
And everybody, you know, kind of thought that a full professorship at any university would be that, or something like it. But it wasn't that way. Even in Michigan, there was a lot of them in the 5,000, but they're still way higher than just about double what OSU.
Who was your favorite professor at A&M?
Oh, I don't know as I could say. A lot of them were good. I remember the poorest professor I ever had in my life was there, though, in plant physiology. And I just about had to learn that on my own afterwards, because he wasn't a good professor. And you know what? I got on the Regents in, 60, some early 60s. And that old man was still teaching.
He was. What's his name?
Oh gosh. I couldn't tell you now. I shouldn't anyway on this.
Yeah, okay, yeah. We're talking about you now.
If I'd been
Don,
there a little
before I
later.
go, Don came in and said Roy McKee was who he was trying to reach, right? Okay, he's out doing something, printing trees or something, and they're not sure where. They expect him back for lunch around 11:30, and he'll call as soon as he gets back
Oh,
for
great,
lunch.
great.
Don's expecting a call from him.
Great.
I'll be back in a few
I've been
minutes.
wanting to get an interview with him.
Yeah.
I tried to do this for the Forest Heritage Center a little bit, and I see how you're doing it, which is the way it should be done. If you can lead Roy into his days first, he came in here and worked in the woods. He's not a forester, but he was an old timber buyer. He must have started in 20s. But I was going to tell you that the one that I would have said would have been my favorite would have been Glenn Durrell.
Yeah.
He was a fine teacher.
Was he there in 35?
No. He was still, let's see, in 35. I think he became state forester in 36.
Yeah, he was, I think, a second state forester.
Yeah, Phillips,
Yeah.
who's still living.
Yeah, right.
And fine old man. We got them together at the Heritage Center a year or so ago, and it was fun to watch and listen to them. They had their old payroll books from those days, and they were looking.
Does the Heritage Center have the books?
John Bain found it among some stuff at the old Division of Forestry office when Bill Mitchell was there.
In fact, I'm interviewing John Bain tomorrow, and he's bringing in R.L. Wallace and Mr. Slater.
Okay, great.
And so I'm working with John Bain down here.
Yeah, John's a fine.
He is.
He's made that Forest Heritage Center. See, he works for the state, but they've kind of put him on loan, and he can do anything. He's pretty good at making exhibits, and he'll do them himself.
Yeah.
But what you're doing was was for the Heritage Center. I got to thinking about an old man we called Fatty Delisle. He worked up at Cleveland when I first knew him, and he was assistant logging superintendent up there, and he became logging superintendent for Dierks. And by the time I got to him, he was in a rest home over at Valiant, and he had emphysema so bad that I couldn't get a good tape of it. He'd just whisper almost, and I'd get some of it, but I was interested in talking to him about the days when there was a large lumber company at Fort Towson, which went out of business, and I was asking him if he remembered that. He had worked for them, and he told me they were doing railroad logging. And he said the biggest problem is they didn't know how to build a railroad. Their maintenance was too bad, you know.
What's railroad logging?
Well, they would simply lay track
Oh, that's just laying the track.
up through the woods, all the way to the mill,
Okay.
and build spurs up the valleys, you know. His description of it, you remember in your forest history that in the lake states they used the shay. It was a geared locomotive, went real slow, but it would pull. They didn't worry about slopes. It could go up a 20% slope, you know, with a load of logs. And they just ran these spurs everywhere. But he thought they had not done it properly, and they'd always be breaking down, turning the locomotive over or something. You know, it just the rail gave away. But he worked on the railroad, so, and in logging. But I gave that tape because it wasn't of any value to us, but I gave it to Betty. It was Betty Belisle, now Betty Bagwell, Tom Bagwell's wife.
Yeah.
Because that was her father-in-law.
Yeah. Okay.
And she just loved old Fatty and took care of him all his life. He died shortly after I tried that.
Mm-hmm.
But you always wait too long.
That's right.
That's why I wanted to get Roy McKee for you if I
Yeah.
could. He remembers names and places. His mind is real good.
Do you remember W.E. Ward?
W.E. Ward.
He he worked down here in the 30s. He was at the WPA camp at Batiste. No, CCC camp at Batiste.
Oh no, I remember Ferguson.
Now he worked with Ferguson. He
Okay.
mentions that. He was in that group.
Yeah, the old man Ferguson was an engineer and built all the CC roads.
Okay, well he worked with him.
Yeah, and that man was a fine engineer. He knew how to build a mountain road.
He mentioned being shot at by one of the outlaws. Mr. Ward did.
Yeah.
He and I'm not sure who he was with, but and I can't remember exactly what he talked about, but he was down here in the Forest Service, and he talks about Phillips and Durrell, and we have about 3 hours of him on tape talking about this area.
Yeah.
And he's in Oklahoma City now, and he has emphysema, and but we got a good interview with him.
That's good.
We had to do it in 3 different sessions to get it all. You know, he had to tire out, so we had to come back. What year did you leave Michigan?
1939.
1939.
See, when I transferred during the summer and went to their summer camp because I was a sophomore. You know how it is. You have to go. And I went to a little town up near Iron River in Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula.
How was the summer camp organized?
It was, I tell you, it was an old logging camp of Von Platten and Fox, which was a subsidiary of Ford, and they logged basically the woods that were used in auto spokes, wheels, and we restored that old abandoned logging camp. I think it was given to the university the year before. So there was lots of work to do, and we did a lot of manual work, just making the bunkhouses into dorms and so on.
Is the camp still there?
Yeah. It's at, oh, it's out of Iron River a ways.
You went there in 37?
The summer 37. Then I went back to the campus. First time I was on the campus was that fall.
Okay.
That year.
Did you have any trouble with financing your college education? And I still call that the
Yeah,
depression.
I worked two jobs most of the time, but the best job was for a student. I thought was hashing, because you got your meals.
Yeah.
And I worked in the sorority house, and that was fun.
You call it hashing?
Well, waiting tables,
Okay.
washing dishes,
Yep.
slinging hash, we used to call it. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 1939 you graduated.
Mhm.
And
I remember Dad used to send me $30 a month, and that with my job got me through. I ended up having to borrow a little to finish, and I had a nice little, you know, I didn't have to borrow much, maybe $40, $50. Took me 2 years to pay it back. But
what was your first job after college?
I went back to Tulsa and in the park department because there wasn't any jobs available. While I was looking, and I heard of this job in in DeQueen, Arkansas, and I called, and this man that was working for Dierks Lumber and Coal Company called in, Dierks Lumber and Coal Company, Julian Butch. And I called him, and he said, come on down. I went to work there in DeQueen for a little while, just following him around to get an idea of how the company operated. And then he put me at Mountain Pine, up near Hot Springs, where Mountain Pine was one of the big mills. It's just north of Hot Springs. And I marked timber for the first time it was done up there.
Okay.
In the virgin timber,
Yeah.
you know.
Now what does it entail, marking timber?
Well, I was trying to pick out the over-mature trees, the diseased trees. We'd leave everything that was growing good and just take out that over-mature stuff.
Now did you...
And what I did was I'd go out with the loggers from the log camp. We had a railroad that ran from the log camp back into the cutting area. And I'd run 40 lines, blaze those, and then I'd blaze 4 strips across each.
What's blazing?
Well, marking the tree with a hatchet.
Okay.
Because there was crosscut saws crews, you know, in those days, and we had 4 crews of cutters, and if they stayed within the boundaries of this strip I'd run across the 40, then I'd go back and mark the 40 completely.
Now you call it a 40.
40-acre tracts.
Okay.
It's you know, the legal descriptions of land. And and we logged that whole mill. And I ran all day long, just because that mill was a big one.
Now were these trees of commercial value that you cut out, the diseased trees, the over-mature trees?
Yeah. We would look for certain signs of over-mature timber. One was the conchs up in the tree, the Fomes pini, the heart rot. If it had heart rot, we tried to take it. If it had the Swinitzii, which is a root rot, and it fruits on the ground, usually at the base of the tree. You know, it looks like a cow chip. And we looked for that sign. And if we found that, the tree came out. if we also found that the top was completely flat, it was the bark had gotten smooth, and it had some young timber around it, we'd take it very often. We had to make the marking operable, enough timber mark that it justified the building of a road, you know, to get the timber out. And we had a minimum volume that they could do that on by 40-acre tracts. So we keep that in mind too. We try to give them enough that it was make it an operable situation. I remember the loggers, or the cutters, you got paid by the thousand, and when they'd get through a strip, then a man would follow, a scaler would come behind, and he'd scale the logs in that strip.
And what's that?
He'd measure them and put down the dollar log scale in his tally book. And then when he'd get through with that, he'd take a chunk. Usually, you know, they undercut a tree to drop it, and it'd always be a pretty good sized chunk there that they chop out before they started sawing in, and so it'd fall a certain way. And he'd take that chunk and lay it on the stone, so he'd know he wouldn't tally that tree twice. And
How difficult?
but the sawyers, we called them flatheads, and rosin bellies and certain terms like that. But those fellas, all they counted was themselves to make sure they got paid for what they did, was what they called heavies. And those were trees or logs that would scale over 100 dollar log scale.
100 what?
100 board feet,
100
log
board feet.
scale.
Okay.
No, that's not lumber scale. You know Doyle. But when they'd get back on the truck at night, well, I'd hear them comparing and say, I got so many heavies. Well, when they got their payday, they knew just about, because most of the volume was those big logs. And they'd kind of keep up with the scaler, like counting. They knew they'd cut 6,000 feet or something, you know.
How difficult is it to make a tree fall in a certain direction?
Well, a professional.
Because you're trying to avoid the other trees, aren't you?
Yeah. A professional can do it. He can fall them uphill if he wants to. He can do lots of things. But that's a skill. It was more skillful, took more skill then than it probably does with a power saw. Or now they don't even use a power saw. They use a hydraulic shear. And they don't worry about it, because that big machine has a clamp that clamps up 10, 15 feet. And then they shear it, has the shear under it, and it cuts it off, and they can bring that tree over and lay it down almost, you know.
Okay, that was near Hot Springs?
That was up near Hot Springs. Yeah.
Was that in the national national park?
It's no, the national forest, the Ouachita, commingled sort of with Dierks Holdings in that area. It's one of the areas that I read about here a while back that they were proposing for wilderness. And it's one of the finest areas for growing timber I ever saw. And most people thought it should be a wilderness because there wasn't any signs of logging. We logged it that way.
Yeah.
And as the road signs are gone, stumps are gone, and they think it's a virgin forest.
When did Dierks come in this area?
In the late 1800s, 1895 maybe.
How come they chose this area?
Well, they had a lumber and coal business in Kansas City, and they retail, and the Southwest was just beginning to build, and they couldn't get enough timber, enough lumber to sell, so they decided to buy a mill and manufacture their own. About that time, the Kansas City Southern had come in, running from Kansas City to New Orleans. I'm not sure it was even done when they came, but they came to the end of the railroad at the time. Little community in Oklahoma where they bought a mill. You know, the Kansas City Southern swings into Oklahoma around Poto, and it was just south of Heavener. This little community where they apparently bought a mill or built one. It must have been just a peckerwood type operation. And then as the railroad went on south, they moved south to DeQueen and bought another old mill, and later built one right in the north side of DeQueen. That must have been in the early 1900s. Then they expanded both towards Dierks, where they built a mill, and into Oklahoma. Built a mill at Broken Bow in, I believe it was 1911. And then built a railroad to it from DeQueen. Then they went further west to Wright City and built another one, which is now the Wright City Complex. And about that time, the Frisco, just before that, the Frisco came across from Hope, Arkansas to Paris, Texas. No, didn't go to Paris. It went on to Durant. Went to Durant and made connections with I believe the Katy going to Oklahoma City or something. Anyway, then they connected a railroad from Wright City to Valiant, which hit the Frisco.
So Dierks is a pretty good sized company then.
Well, when I was managing, before I left them in 1960, I was managing 890,000 acres that they owned in fee.
Now, was Dierks a family operation?
Yes, completely. Family, very close family operation.
Who was the old man Dierks? What's his name?
Well, there was three. Let's see, they weren't brothers, I don't believe. They were cousins. Hans, Peter, and Peter Dierks, Hans Dierks, and Herbert were the original, as far back as I can remember. And by the time I was working in the 40s and 50s with that company, it was Fred Sr. was the president, and DeVere Dierks was a cousin who was major stockholder. Those three, there was three of them, and each descendants of the original three. I think DeVere was Peter Dierks' side. Fred was shoot. I better not say because I'm maybe mixed up. And then later, young Fred came into the company. Young DeVere came into the company. And Pete Jowers, who was Peter Dierks Jowers, which was DeVere's sister's boy, came into the company. And then later, DeVere Jr. came in. And, well, they were the active managers, but all of them lived in Kansas City, except Pete and Fred Jr. moved to Hot Springs.
Are there any of the Dierks family left in this area?
Descendants, yeah. Let's see.
Because you mentioned...
Not really, no. There's one, I think, there's one in Hot Springs, still living in Hot Springs. Could be Fred Jr. is still living there. I haven't heard from Fred in a long time. And Pete's still around somewhere. But Peter Dierks, Peter Joer's son, Peter Jr., is living there too, I believe. He may still work for Weyerhauser. He was working for Weyerhauser.
Did Dierks ever go union?
Oh, yeah.
They were unionized?
Mm-hmm.
Any union troubles down here?
Went through a horrible strike in 1953. A lot of violence. I remember they burned railroad bridges, that sort of thing. And there was some union activists from the West Coast came in, and they were pretty rough. If the local union people were getting a little soft on strike, well, they'd beat them up. I remember one of the leaders of that group from the West Coast hauled a man out of the barber chair in Wright City and beat him with a chain right in the middle of the street. They were rough.
Is that what made the company go union or what?
No, they were unionized.
They were unionized?
They've been unionized. They were unionized a long time.
How
That was the only real nasty strike that I remember.
What caused the strike?
I don't know. It was, I think it was over wages, basically. Dierks wasn't known to paying well. They were very generous in emergencies to families. They didn't have any health care or anything else. And the wages were, well, a third of what they would get, same job would get on the West Coast. I remember I had to do logging superintendent's job one time. We had a big tornado went through Oklahoma and into Arkansas around, it'd be south of Smithville, I guess. Cut, you know how those things run northeast. And it tore up a lot of timber up near Hatton, east of Hatton, over on the Cossatot area. And at that time they had a mill at Forestry, which is up near Waldron. They had bought, and that mill ran mostly on Forest Service timber. But there was so much of this timber down in the Hatton area that remember they put me up there and gave me, and it's about 46 or 47, gave me some trucks, an old loader, Austin Western loader, one of the great big crane things, 4 skid cats, which they had just gotten started with that. They were mules, you know, did it all with mules before the war, and after I came back they were trying to change. Fact is, they were trying to change at Mountain Pine when I was in '39. They were beginning to try. They bought some tractors, and they put the mules in the barn, gave the tractors to the mule skinners. I remember those old mule skinners get mad at that tractor. It wouldn't do, you know, they couldn't gee-haw it, you know, and didn't know how to back it up and all that stuff. And they would cuss that tractor just like they was cussing the mules. I saw one man pick up a pine knot and just beat his tractor one day. But all those fellas wanted to do was to get rid of those tractors and get back to mule skid.
Did he ever go back to mules?
No, not that I know of.
I can remember in summer camp, Mr. Durrell took us to one place they're still using mules. And it was down somewhere where they couldn't get a tractor in or something, and they had mules working.
Well, now, I was using, I had contractors when I had the mill here, the old Dugan mill, which I bought in 1960.
Yeah.
Some of my contractors used mules for, say up until 65.
Yeah. Well, this was, they were just building the dam at Broken Bow. And that's when they're putting the lake in, they're trying to get as much timber out as they could.
Yeah.
And they were bringing mules in there. And that was in 66 in summer camp. Because that was right before, when did they finish that dam?
About that time, about 60.
Yeah, that was about.
About 66. It was closed, I think, probably. They closed the gate somewhere around 66, 67.
Yeah, because I know that they were trying to get as much timber out as they could, and I guess they're using everything they get their hands on to get the timber out before they closed the gates.
Well, that and Dierks had sold them. I think they took over 10,000 acres of Dierks land in that lake itself, and they were trying to get it out.
Next question. World War II.
My son went to summer camp in what they call it was up in Kentucky, and it was in the Hardwoods land. See what they call it? Land between the lakes.
Yeah.
And that must have been an experience.
You know, we were kind of disgusted, my summer camp, because
Yeah.
I had been to Oregon, New York, Kentucky, and we go to Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, I remember the kids they weren't real happy with that. And the professors weren't either. But they figured they had to sometime. I guess Glenn's idea has spread some to other forestry schools, but they're right now, when this new man came in, Carpenter came in, first thing he wanted to do is establish a permanent camp. They've sold him off of the idea. He sees now that the value of that. Old Glenn was way ahead of his time.
Yeah, this one thing Mr. Durrell stressed, he said that I do not agree with these schools that have those summer camp in the same place every year.
Neither did he agree with some of the other. He didn't like the accrediting system of the Society of American Foresters.
He said not so much for the students, but he said it keeps the professors on their toes to go to different areas.
I hear my Johnny talk about it. The summer camp was really an experience.
Yeah, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think Mr. Durrell said that OSU was the only one that had traveling summer camp at that time.
Well, one thing it did too, and this was kind of a side effect, but where those summer camps had been, like out in the west, out in Oregon, those companies out there and the Forest Service out there decided to try graduates from OSU. And I've had them tell me in meetings out there and up in Milwaukee or wherever I'd go, if I'd run into a Forest Service man from the west, he said, do you know, and he found out I was from Oklahoma, he said, do you know if there's any more of those good OSU foresters? He said, and I'd say, why? And he'd say, they come willing to work. They're not maybe the most studious types, but they will work, and they'll work with people. And I said, well, what do you suppose the reason? He said, I think they come from the farms.
Yep.
They've got farm backgrounds. They know how to fix things because they watched their daddies fix tractors and stuff. You know, they can bale and wire it. You know, and the OSU grads had a real good reputation, and Glenn kept up with them.
Yep.
Remember the map he had there in the office? He had a pin for everywhere.
That's right.
They knew their names.
I talked to John Bain yesterday, and he had that rock that Glenn Durrell carried for years.
Yeah, isn't that cute?
And I remember he brought that to class, and he sent that down to John Bain for the Heritage Center down here.
And the letter came with it was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I read the letter.
Oh, if you haven't read it, Glenn's wife, Hazel, and she was a beautiful thing. She wrote this, an article for some little magazine there in Arkansas, and it got printed in the Ouachita National
Yeah,
Forest.
he showed me that article.
Okay.
He's going to give me a copy of it.
What did she call it? Forest Lady.
Yeah, and also the article Glenn wrote, not changing times, but it's a prediction he made what's going to happen in the next 30 years.
Yeah, I've got it up
Yeah.
in my office. He hit it pretty close, didn't he?
Certainly
I gave
did.
it to I gave that to Jim Monroe, our newspaperman. Told him there ought to be a story in there somewhere, and he wrote a little editorial using those figures.
Yeah.
And those predictions.
World War II.
Well, let's go before that. Remember, I left Dierks. I was working doing this marking at North Hot Springs. They had funny names for their camps. Their logging out camps, where just loggers lived. And I was living in a little shotgun house. Of course, I was a bachelor. And my roommate was a fellow that drove a truck. And just before Christmas in 1940, I decided I wasn't able to pay back my university debt on what I was making. I was making 37.5 cents an hour. But I was liking it very much, but I found out that I could go to work for Glenn Durrell here in Oklahoma with the Division of Forestry at $100 a month. And I took it. So I went to Antlers. And so we were setting up
What year was that?
1940.
1940.
I think I started January 1st, 1940 with them. So I didn't work at that time that long with Dierks. But we only had one, the Division of Forestry only had one fire protection area then in Oklahoma, and that was in southeast Oklahoma, out of Broken Bow. And that was where Glenn was hired from the Forest Service. He was hired by the Dierks people in 1927, I believe. And he set up a fire protection, company fire protection. And later that was taken over by the state. And anyway, he wanted to establish, and he got the what do they call it, the Resources Board, the Oklahoma Resources Board, is that what they call it? That the division was under at that time. He got them to agree to establish some more fire protection areas, and Antlers was one, and Wilburton was headquarters for another one. And I went to work at Antlers for him, and worked for Glenn. I was district forester. Just one guy, no help. But I was PR mostly. I was trying to, my job was to get the folks in north of Antlers, Findlay, and up through to Clayton, all interested in some fire protection. And I mostly just went around to ranches and farms and talked to people, put up signs, fire prevention signs, Smokey Bear signs,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
and go to schoolhouses and show little movies and did all that stuff, trying to get things started. And then I fought fire too, but just because had to show the folks a little bit how it's done, and it was something to stand up on a mountain north of, up around snow, be in the middle of about 20 fires that were burning around you at night, trying to put out one, and knowing that it was 2,000 acres burning all around you and you couldn't do anything about it. I used to burn that country.
What caused all those fires?
They were sad.
How come people said them?
Well, I think it started with the Indians, really. It was a way to get early grass. It was also a way to keep the pine under control, the new pine that was coming up. When that country was virgin timber, well, here too, Broken Bow, north of Broken Bow, all through, the virgin timber was rather open, and there was very little regeneration under it because of the fires. And it was grass, good grass, native grass, up to the belly of a horse. You could see a quarter of a mile up through it. It was rather easy to make your way in the woods. When I came, it wasn't all virgin anymore, but there was still a good deal of it.
Mm-hmm.
All that country around Cleveland and Pickens was north of Cloudy, and up Little River was virgin. And besides trying to cruise the area, they hadn't had a inventory. They didn't know really what they had in the way of timber in Oklahoma. I started marking, and they never had any marking in Oklahoma. It was always chopper's choice. But in 1926, when Glenn came, he must have interested the old Dierks family in attempting to do something about regeneration, and not to clear cut anymore. They used to go in and take everything and make a 2x4. Then burn the woods themselves. The logging superintendent burned the woods before they skidded, so they wouldn't miss anything. That's why we had an area north of Wright City we called the Wright City Burn. There must have been 20,000 acres in there that they had just ruined.
When I drove down from Wilburton, I drove through some areas that had been clear cut. Everything gone. And looks like they had been burned. And they were 40, 50, 60 acre tracts. Is Weyerhauser clear cutting again?
Yeah, they brought that system of management with them. And
is that a better system than?
well, it's more profitable. It's just like if you had a ranch and it was only growing half the grass it was capable of growing. You know, they were interested in putting it. See, even under selective management that we were practicing, when I set up the stuff over here, that system, we couldn't really get the land in its best condition. It was just an attempt to improve on nature, that system. And it worked, but it was no way to utilize what they know of genetics. Look what look what they've done in Iowa in corn. I remember it hadn't been 20 years that 100 bushel to the acre yield in corn was considered good up there. They're looking at 400 now. It's all through genetics, hybrids.
Yeah.
And they're doing it with trees now, but that's the only way they can, is to get to the bare soil and start over.
Now in '66, I can remember, I can't think of the professor's name, but they would find the superior trees that were straight without the twist, that had good pruning, and they would shoot the branches off and prune them on young trees.
Yes,
Has
he
that
was
system worked
doing
out?
that.
I can't think what his name
That was a research, more research.
Did that
work.
ever work out? That
Oh, you couldn't
project?
shoot enough. You couldn't get enough cones that way to establish a nursery. That.
Well, they were getting branches and grafting on.
Oh yeah. They're still doing it.
They are.
They're still looking for these superior trees, and they get these scions from those and graft them to rootstock. But then they crossbreed now too. They can get some hybrid vigor by, say, crossing loblolly with shortleaf. They can get, they get the superior seed from superior trees of the two. Then they can cross-pollinate. That's what they're doing out here at the east of town on the experiment station. That is a genetics experiment station, really.
How do you set up a fire protection? Of course, you mentioned putting up the signs and going to schools. Is that about the only thing you can do for fire protection in this area?
Well, that's all we could do then. Didn't have money to buy tractors and crews and try to extend it. And there wasn't really much point in fighting fire until you got the people wanting it. And we were just kind of like itinerant preachers trying to.
So public education.
Yeah, and it's still going on. They're still studying why people burn. Glenn can tell you more about that than anybody. He went through it from the very beginning.
So how long did you work for Glenn there at Antlers?
Well, I was drafted in August of '41, so see, I was about a year and a half.
Where'd you go through basic?
I went to Fort Sill first, and then out to California to Camp Callan, which is now the site of that Andy Williams golf. What do they call that golf course? Anyway, it's on what was the old camp. And I was there when the Pearl Harbor hit. And of course, everybody was shook up. They put us rookies up on those bluffs overlooking the Pacific with one BAR and 8 guys, no ammunition, very little ammunition.
What part
They
of
were
the
so sure that the Japanese were going to.
What part of the Pacific were you guarding?
San Diego there.
San Diego.
This Callan was right near San Diego, and it was seacoast artillery. Of course, that was abandoned rather quickly. We went from there later to Camp Davis, North Carolina, to OCS, and at that time they broke up the old seacoast and made us anti-aircraft, automatic weapons. There, after I got to be a second lieutenant, I went to South Texas. What's it called?
What, on the coast?
Yeah.
There's Fort Crockett.
No, that wasn't that one. This was
That's at Houston, I think,
Yeah,
Fort Crawford.
no, this was at Palacios.
Okay.
I went
Well,
to
Fort Davis,
I went
but
to
that's
my
down in
first hurricane there.
Corpus Christi.
The one that hit Corpus Christi and
Okay.
blew our camp away. Pretty, I mean, you know, just washed it away. But
Tell me about-
then back to New York and overseas.
Tell me about
Casablanca.
basic.
Hmm.
About basic Fort Sill. How long did it last?
Well, actually Fort Sill was simply a holding pen for till you got assigned to a branch of the military, and then
Okay.
you'd go like to Callan or to. Well, let's see, there was a training camp up in Illinois, and over there a bunch of them,
And you took training there in San Diego?
Yeah, basic training was at San Diego,
And
near San Diego,
yeah.
La Jolla.
How long did that last?
I don't remember. It seemed like it was a year or more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't too long because the Oklahoma, the OCS was, I think it was 9 weeks, wasn't it?
Tell me about the trip overseas. Did you leave from New York?
Yeah. We landed in October of '42.
Have any
We landed in Casablanca.
North Africa?
Uh-huh.
Any trouble going over with the?
Oh, just
U-boats?
seasickness. That was the worst thing.
Yeah, no
Everybody
U-boats?
was sick all the time.
Yeah, no U-boats or anything on the way?
Oh, at least they didn't hit us.
Yeah. What unit were you with overseas?
With an anti-aircraft 437th Automatic Weapons Battalion, a separate battalion. And we were assigned to the airfield at Casablanca to start with. Then we just followed the North African campaign from there all the way around Tunis, Bizerti, then into Sicily, or Italy. I didn't get into Sicily. Into Italy and up to Rome. It was just always automatic weapons.
Did you get to Anzio?
No, see that was the Anzio. No, that was that right after Anzio is when they hit the battalion. See, I think I remember going down to the beach though at Anzio one time.
Was it after the breakout?
Yeah.
What was the major battles you were in?
Oh, golly. The one I remember probably the most, we had some air attacks, German air attacks when we were at Casablanca, but they weren't frequent. But really, North Africa wasn't all that. The Germans just weren't able to supply their air force that far at the time. And but when we got into Italy, things got pretty warm. I remember Venafro was quite a battle, and we were then being assigned more to the tank warfare, because we learned we could use the 90 millimeter and the 40 millimeter really pretty effectively on ground, except it sits up, and you had no protection. But it was an accurate gun. It wasn't as accurate as the 88 German gun either, but it was good, especially the 90 millimeter. If you had a crew that got real good, they could hit a tank in the window. It was a good rifle.
Yeah.
And we started. They put us with the engineers that were building you know, build a bridge across the Benefro River to get the Germans on the other side.
So
We got bombed a time or two by our own planes in that deal.
Mhm. Are you familiar with the deal at Scogliti?
The what?
Scogliti was that in Sicily?
I don't remember that name.
That's where, as I understand it, the Germans captured 1 or 2 American airplanes intact, American markings and everything.
Right. We got hit by them on the Benefro River because we didn't know. We got hit 2 or 3 times by strafing, and we thought it was our own people. But we were. I remember sitting in the bunker on the south side of that river and looking up at the Monte Cassino Abbey, and the Germans were using that because it sat on top of the mountain. And of course, we were told not to shell that just Abbey. We finally had to.
Were you there when they destroyed it, the Abbey?
Yeah.
What was your thoughts when that was going on?
Well, it was more or less, thank goodness we finally doing it. Because they were killing us from that thing.
And that's been completely restored now.
Has it?
Yeah, the Americans went in after the war and completely rebuilt it. It looks just like it did.
But we were, you know, we were always hunting defilade, so we wouldn't get hurt by that directed artillery from that Abbey. And shoot, they'd pick us up. We had a shell hit right in the middle of our kitchen. But the worst thing that happened was a flood. And you talk about head rises on the rivers down here. We had that on that river the night before Christmas, and water got into our positions. The only thing we tried to save was the kitchen because we had just gotten turkey. Had shipped them up to us. We were going to have a big time Christmas Day. And we lost all those turkeys. We would run a little 6x6 truck up to the kitchen, and the water was up in the cab by that time, and it was just about to go over the top of those old military stoves, you know, the army stoves. And we had the turkey was already cooked and in them. And we'd run a tube of 12, let's say a 16-foot tube of 12 or something, from the back of that truck to the top of one of the stoves and walk out on that thing and try to get the turkey out of it. And we had guys falling in, you know.
Yeah, how many turkeys you saved?
I don't think we saved any. We ate sea rations the next day. Then we came back out of Italy when Rome fell. What you got?
I'll come get it when I get back if you need. If y'all wanted to.
Okay.
And back to Naples. And
were you there when Mount Vesuvius erupted?
no. Then we went into Marseille and went with the advanced north to Berlin.
Did you go into Berlin?
No. No, we were on the outskirts when it was over.
Did you?
But we got into some beautiful country in northern France that I liked because it was forested. And you know, I tried all the time I was in the Army to get into the forest engineers. I had applications all the time to do it. We ran, you know, the military ran some sawmills, and I thought that'd be an excellent opportunity to learn milling. And never could make it. you know, the military, but they broke us up as a automatic weapons battalion when the Luftwaffe, yeah, finally was grounded for the bombing, you know, deprived them of gasoline. And I remember those Autobahns going into Berlin were wonderful highways that they had built, military highways. They'd be lined with German fighter planes. All of them, just no way to get them off the ground.
Did you go into any of the death camps over there?
No.
You missed all that.
Yeah, I missed that. We, I remember in the Colmar region, which is that area between France and Germany, and it often would change in hands, you know. So one century it was German, and the next century it was French. And they had beautiful forests, pure, even age, monoculture, and they've been using the Weyerhauser system for years. But it was kind of nice to see what we had read in the textbooks about, you know, the German methods of forest management. Anyway, when the war was over, almost over, and there wasn't any need for any aircraft, they gave me that was the last gasp the Germans did, you know, was the breakthrough at
Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah. And they gave me a choice of going in the infantry or taking a colored trucking company. You know, and they were segregated in those days. And I decided I'd seen enough. I was going to take the trucking company.
What did you do in the trucking company?
We ran ammunition, 45th Division. But it was a good experience. I learned something about maintenance of equipment, how to handle kids from Brooklyn that didn't know one way from up. I was always glad when I could find somebody from the Midwest. And the black boys, the best ones were in the company were from New Orleans, Louisiana. The blacks that hadn't been street walkers, you know, the zoot suiters and so on. It was popular in New York and Brooklyn.
What did you do in VE Day?
I don't remember. I think we were bivouacked somewhere around Berlin, south of Berlin, somewhere in there.
Did you spend any time in the Army of Occupation?
Yes.
What'd you do there?
For a trucking company. They kept the trucking company going.
Yeah. Okay. So when
I
you
remember
were
it used to bug me that I wanted to come home, and I stayed, I guess, almost a year. Longer than I had points. You know how they used to do it. You got points for various campaigns and stuff, time in service. I had enough points to come home a long time before that, but they needed the trucking because they were moving supplies to the French and restoring places. That was a good experience. Got all over Germany. Got down to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, where the Olympics were held one year, and saw those ski spots. Nice resort country near Munich.
You ever meet the Russians?
No. We served with the British in Africa. And sometimes, one time in Italy, we were assigned to protect a French gumi Italian. And the Arabs, you know, that was something. Those people. Makes you wonder why in the world we're over there fooling with them. They have an entirely different outlook on life. Life means nothing to them.
I found that out.
Did you? And it just doesn't make sense that we're trying to make them over. Because you're not going to do it. Those Muslims have an entirely different standard of living.
That's right.
Their ethics, their, well, beginning with their religion, I guess, but it's,
Well, if you die in battle, you go straight to heaven.
yeah. But they would kill just for the, if they thought it was a Christian, Catholic, whatever. As long as you were Christian, it was all right. And I've seen them cut GIs' throats just for their shoes. We lost pretty good men to those kinds all through Africa. It was rough to try to live and understand them.
Yeah.
I remember I had to do a service as the officer in charge of police, and the job was to make sure that we patrolled the old Medina in Casablanca. Remember that movie?
Yeah.
But that was, the idea was to keep our GIs out of that place, because that's where they got killed. But I remember myself and two military policemen were patrolling that little walled city is what it was. It was just set. I remember walking down one of those streets, and they're a little narrow with balconies, and I had a naked woman jump off the balcony of one of those things right on my back. Scared me to death. But when we'd catch a GI in there, the first thing we'd do was get him out of there and go get a pro on him, you know. Have him examined and just keep him out.
What'd you call that walled city? What's the name?
The Medina.
Medina?
The old Medina.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, like you probably got a chance to do in the East, was to see some things. You know, we'd get rest and recuperation, 3 days sometimes. And it was interesting. And there, I remember going to Constantinople, the old Constantine. And that was, you know,
Santa
we'd
Sophia.
find out about some of these old Roman ruins. And we'd take a Jeep, and 2 or 3 of us, and go. And that was when I got interested in, I guess, in archaeology again. It was it is hard to stand there and think that here, 20,000 years ago, maybe, 1,000 years ago, there was a thriving city. You could see, you know, they had excavated a lot in it, and you could see the buildings, and they'd restored a little of it if it had fallen over the.
th century A.D. It's over 1,000 years old. This big crack is in the wall, and the people were afraid of it, and the engineer said, no, complete it. Put the dome on, it'll stop. They got the dome on, and the crack is the same place, hasn't moved an inch, because he had the thing perfectly designed with the dome was evenly spread.
Oh.
And but then the Muslims took it over. It was a Christian church, Muslim, it was a Byzantine, I don't know what all it's been, and finally all the religions argued, they made it a museum. So it's not a church anymore. They couldn't agree on what it was going to be.
I did get to go through the church in Rome. In a big
St.
Catholic-
Peter's?
Yeah. And got to see the Colosseum.
Did you ever meet Pope Pius
No,
in Rome?
no.
When did you come back to this country? What?
In October of '45.
October 45. What was the first thing you did?
Well, I went to see my grandmother in Winsted, where I was born.
Yeah.
Then came straight home. And went straight to DeQueen and went to work. I was ready to get back in the woods.
Did you?
I didn't take any time.
Did you go back to work for Dierks?
Uh-huh.
Now, was that treating plant in DeQueen that you worked at?
Mm-hmm. They just started. They were just starting it. And they gave me the task of supplying it with posts. It was just strictly posts, fence posts, treated fence posts then. And my job was to get contractors and teach them how to peel them in the woods, cut them in 6.5 foot lengths, and peel them and take them to the plant.
That seemed like it'd be an awful dirty job over there with all that creosote.
Well, it was. It's not that anymore, but it's starting up something that they had no experience with. It was a dirty job. It was a dirty job in the woods because of the rosin peeling, hand peeling. The guys did it with hoes. Just straighten up a hoe so you could push it.
Yeah.
And design the end of it so that it kind of conformed a little, and then there was so many areas in that part of Arkansas that had been abandoned fields during the Civil War, and when they were abandoned they came in heavy into pine from the seed source around those little farms. We called them old field stands, and it was second growth, of course, and they had grown so thick that they had nature thinned them out. And they were just whips. They would be 60, 70 years old and just no limbs except a little bitty crown. You'd lay those things down and cut them up into posts. They were all just like gun barrels. And you hand peeled them and hand loaded them on a truck, loaded them off, and they would be slick. Especially if you got a little rain, shower or something, keep them on a truck after they were peeled. It was a job. And we paid so much a post.
How did you creosote the post back then when they first started?
They had pressure cylinders. They were the first ones that had any kind of a pressurized system. There were several post operations going, several here in Oklahoma. But they were using just black oil.
Just a soaking method or what?
Soak them. They had tanks, rather large tanks they could fill with the post and then pump the oil over them, and often they had a butane system underneath the tank where they'd heat it. Could heat the oil and then it would soak up even more. But they used to have to dry the posts in order to do it right. And there was many a little company started here. Well, like the Nixons started with a tank. Huffman's started with just a tank. And I've been in the hardware store in Broken Bow many times when a guy with his truck sitting outside loaded with freshly oiled post. He'd come in and buy a gallon of creosote and pour over it, so it smelled like creosote, and headed for Kansas.
What is creosote?
I couldn't tell you chemically.
I mean, is it a petroleum product or what?
It's also made from coal. It's a derivative of coal or any of the oil, petroleum derivatives. Remember coal tar creosote? That was a byproduct from the coal industry. But it was a very fine preservative. Then in a year or two, the pentachlorophenol became popular because you could paint it after 90 days. It could be painted. But the thing about the pressure treating business is that you can pull a vacuum. The Forest Products Lab, in Madison, worked on preservatives for many years, and they came up with the minimum, say, amount of creosote or penta, expressed in pounds per cubic foot of wood that would preserve for at least 30 years. And with the controlled cylinder system, they can pull a vacuum after they put it under pressure into the post, and they can pull that stuff right back out to where they're leaving 5 pounds per cubic foot of active ingredients, of the penta. And when you do that, then that post would 90 days on the yard, and it was paintable. Because the volatile, they used the carrying oils that would volatile enough to get away, and it left you just a penta.
Who came up with the idea of the pressure cylinder?
Oh,
Who developed that?
I really don't know. It probably started, I bet it started in Germany.
Yeah.
So many of the processes that we took up and improved on were basically German. I went to a German sawmill one day in the Colmar region. That was interesting, and I'd never seen anything like this. It was a water-powered mill, one-man operation. He would pick a log and put it on his little carriage and pull a lever, and so that the mill wheel would start turning everything. The saw would travel slow enough you could almost see the teeth. It was a circle saw. And he'd pull he had a bell hanging there. His home was right next to the mill. It's kind of like a cowbell. And when that finally, it just was slow, just about like this, going through the log, not even that fast, just very slow. It might take 20 minutes to make a cut. When the board fell off, after it was cut through, it rang his bell. He'd come back out of the house and set the dogs, turn the log, set the dogs. But when he got through with that log, and it was all cut up, then he'd shut down and take that log, those boards from that log, and stack them just like they had come out of the log. Put stickers between them. But he had a log then that a furniture buyer could come and buy that log, and he could match the grains. It had figure.
Yeah.
He'd build a table, and that was the German system. It was very, very interesting.
What are the dogs?
They're the old sharpened hooks that hold the log on the carriage and hold it into the saw. Hold it for it so it won't fall off. They're just clamps.
Okay.
With what is it? What it would be comparable of? I don't know. Other than in a mill that I ever saw it being used like that.
Yeah, it just holds the log in place so that it won't back off from the saw blade.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Down at Wright City, when we went down there, what time we got?
Quarter after. Why don't I call my wife? You want to continue this round two? I'll just call her. That's a good place to eat. They've taken their vacation. Our club manager. I said, "Where are you going?" "Spend the week." He said, "Seminole." I said, "Who in the hell wants to go to Seminole?" You've looked into the history of Seminole, I'm sure, haven't you?
Well, they had the big oil boom there back in the 20s.
Remember the story about the old boy that had the livery? Rented wagons and horses and stuff. And he kept there was dirt Main Street, and he kept a great big hole of water out in the middle of Main Street. And he made his money hauling people through it because they'd get stuck. That was when the cars started coming in, you know.
Right.
They'd get stuck in that thing every time they tried to go down Main Street. And he'd get his mules out and pull them out. And they even caught him adding water to it. I don't know whether that's a true story or not, but they used to tell that about someone.
Yeah. Well, how long did you work for Dierks then at DeQueen at the treating plant?
Oh, not too long. They had this storm at North, and they decided to make me a logger. I was logging superintendent for that operation, and that took about 6 months. And we logged the storm, and you know how those tornadoes do. This was a big one. It was probably a quarter of a mile wide.
Yeah.
Just wiped everything out, right across those mountains. Started up around Carter Mountain in Oklahoma. But the Oklahoma people at that time took care of trying to clean that up, which they never did very well. But down the valleys that lead into, or some of the valleys that lead into the path of this storm, those side winds would take a lot of timber down in those. We had one in April of '82 that here, north of town, that went through just south of Broken Bow. It wasn't as big a one, but it tore up Ned. And I have 40 acres I had planted in 1960 when I left the company, because I never could buy forest land. As long as I was buying it for them, if I liked it well enough and it was a bargain, I felt it was just a conflict of interest for me to buy any timber or any land, really. But the minute I left them, I bought this 40-acre, an old farm, worn-out farm, and planted it. And I lost 60 trees that were better than 20 years old to that storm, and it was a quarter of a mile north of, the path of it was just about a quarter mile north of my 40 acres. But, you know, the side winds going in. Anyway, I had never taken my GI Bill. See, I already had a degree and didn't know. And I hated not to take advantage of some. So I got my pilot's license at Horatio. I was living in DeQueen. I drive down there every day, and then the storm hit. I had already was soloing, and foolish as it was, I didn't, you don't know any better, except that the first hours that you fly after you got your license, you think you're real good, You don't realize some of the dangers in flying those little planes. And I flew that storm, every day doing my solo and hunt up patches of timber that we would otherwise miss. So we, stupid, it wouldn't have been a place to put that plane down, flying 500 feet above those mountains and downdrafts, and I got into a few of them, but I was just lucky. I got home one night and looked at my life insurance policy, and it didn't cover me. It didn't cover me flying in a light plane. It covered me on a commercial, and I had 2 little kids. I never got back in the plane again. Piloting, I'd always get somebody that had a lot of hours. But I used to do a lot of flying for timber. Anyway, went up and we logged that stuff and hauled it into a yard on the Kansas City Southern at Hatton, and put it on gondolas. Loaded those things in gondolas and shipped them to Forestry, which was out of Waldron, and got that cleaned up. Then, about that time, see, that was in '48. Mr. Craig, who was a long-time land manager for them here, for all of Oklahoma, his health began to go on him, and they thought they'd better start a replacement, so they moved me over here, kind of as assistant to him, but it was chief forester, they called it, and then I talked him into management. I got DeVere to go down to Crossett and just look at what they were doing. And he did, and came back and wanted it all done yesterday. And so they gave me the green light to start hiring some foresters. We hired 12, split the 800 plus 8,000 acres up into 6 units, put 2 foresters on each one, built them homes, drilled wells for them. So I got some experience in building. Contract those out, and then supervise to make sure they built them right. We were paying them for it. But then '48 is when I came back here to Broken Bow. And I worked closely with Mr. Craig and then tried to start this forestry management bit where everything was marked. We marked all of the remaining virgin timber in Oklahoma that we owned in Oklahoma. We really finished up cutting virgin timber in about 55, 56, somewhere in there.
Any virgin timber left around here now?
You mean of the old Dierks holdings? Yeah. No, I think they probably covered everything.
So everything now is pretty well second or third growth?
Yeah, well, no, the way we marked that virgin timber, we did it just like we did at Mountain Pine. We took out just the old trees. So you've got, it's old growth. There's still a lot of old growth, but it's not over mature. It's probably 150 years old instead of 250.
Will any of that be set aside as? Now, is that in the National Forest?
No, see, this is their own holdings.
Okay.
When Weyerhauser acquired them, they acquired Dierks.
Now, do they cut in the National Forest? Are they allowed to?
Yeah, when the National Forest decides to cut a compartment, it's marked, they put it up for bid sale, and Weyerhauser gets some of it. The Forest Service tries, in this particular case, because Weyerhauser has a lot of their own, to make the sale units on the National Forest small enough that, like Drew Huffman or the old Reynolds Wilson mill, the independent mills could bid and get it. The idea was that they wanted to help support small industry too. Very seldom, really, has Weyerhauser gotten a sale in Oklahoma. Now they actively bid on sales in Arkansas, in the Washita, around Hot Springs and up in there, because they didn't have the base over there. They had 2 units over there that weren't both of them put together. 2 mills, Dierks and Mountain Pine. Those 2 mills and a paper mill, Pine Bluff. But they didn't have as much land for those 2 mills and the paper mill as we had here. They had more volume of timber though.
Okay.
Because they started fire protection in Arkansas about 20 years earlier than we did, and that's the reason.
Yeah.
They got regrowth, and those mills were built, both Dierks and Mountain Pine was the last one they built, I think. It was the newest. But anyway, so of course, my knowledge of Oklahoma started in 1940, let's say.
Right.
But it was really 48 before I got back over here working all the time.
How long did you work for Dierks then, after the war?
Till 1960.
And in 48 you came back to this area, Broken Bow, Idabel?
Broken Bow in 48.
Yeah.
Then Mr. Craig's health got real bad in 55, and they transferred me down here. I just drove from Broken Bow every day. In 57 I moved down here.
Yeah. So you bought land for Dierks then?
Yeah, paid their taxes, bought their lands.
What was that? What was your title?
Land manager.
Land manager?
Got all the legal work done that was required to get.
Now, do they actually own the land or just the timber?
They own the land.
They own the land.
Fee simple,
Okay.
which is complete. That's above ground, below ground.
Well, mineral rights and everything.
Yeah. So much of the land they had put together, they had bought at those big sales in 1917, 18, 19, unallotted lands, Choctaw unallotted lands, and they'd hold these big sales in Muskogee. And a lot of speculators bought lots of it. I remember one fellow, just going through titles, I see his name so much. He must have bought thousands of acres for roughly $5. It was all appraised, $5 an acre, so from 3 to maybe 7 tops. Because timber, and when that was done, timber was worth $1 a thousand stumpage.
That's $1 for 1,000 board feet?
Yeah, log scale. On their estimates, what.
Yeah. It's gone up a little bit.
Some places they cut north of Wright City. I remember when we were cruising, finding this enormous area with no timber, but pine knots all over the ground under hardwood brush. So you knew there'd been a heavy stand there. So I'd go back to Mr. Craig's old records, and he kept good records, and would look that 40 acres up, and it had logged 10,000 to the acre. And there wasn't a pine tree on it, in half a mile. So those areas we experimented with, trying to see if we could get them back into production. We tried lots of things, mostly underplanting with seedlings. I remember the first planting we did was in 48.
Now what's underplanting?
Well, we just simply, 2 or 3 of us would go out there with dibbles and seedlings, 1-year-old seedlings that we'd got. I remember we got them from Missouri, a nursery in Missouri. The first year I tried it, I bought 18,000 of them. And we just take the dibble and work in the rocks. We try to find an opening between the hardwood overstory and stick a tree in. If we didn't get 200 or 300 to the acre, well, it was fine. It just, we'd get them started. And then we went back the next year and deadened all the hardwood we could to release the seedlings. We've got some pretty, of that our first planting, we've got a forest established. It's not real good because it struggled with the competition.
Yeah.
We didn't spend over a couple of dollars an acre deadening.
How do pines compete with the hardwoods? They compete well?
Yeah, they'll compete well, but if they're ever overtopped, in other words, if they're competition for the water, and the big tree is pumping, the big hardwood tree pumps a lot of water, and it shuts off the direct sunlight for growth. Those little pine trees, I've seen them where we didn't get a good kill, say, and the tree would be 10 years old, still there, but just stunted,
Yeah.
sitting there. And you can release that type of thing and it'll take off, but it never will have the same vigor and a total growth that if it had full sunlight, all the water it needed. The shortleaf pine, which is mostly what was native in the mountains, it's fairly tolerant to shade. It'll live, but it also does its best when it's got full sunlight, just like Douglas fir out west.
Got a question. Back in the archives in Oklahoma City where I work, we're finding a lot of records where a lot of people were arrested who were sneaking across from Arkansas and Texas cutting wood in Indian territory.
Yeah.
A lot of that go on in this area.
Terrific. When I came here, you could go up on Sam Williams Mountain and hear them working. And it wasn't just from Arkansas. It was local
With poachers.
poachers. Especially when the post market blossomed. And it was still hard times. During the Depression, about the only thing that people had for a little food money was to go out in the woods and cut ties. The railroads were one thing that was really still developing. And we'd catch them stealing good hardwood timber to make ties. And they'd hew them with a broad axe out in the woods. And remember in '32, Prohibition ended, and suddenly there was a market for white oak for bourbon staves. And Dierks had in 35 and 36 had built a new mill over on Kiamishi Bottoms, just on the north side of the Kiamishi Mountains. It was called Pine Valley. It was a beautiful new mill, and they had bought at unallotted land sales and had never logged maybe 200,000 acres in the Winding Stair Mountains, south of Poto, south of Huebner. So they put this mill in. Well, the Depression hit them, and that mill cut out and just closed down. But from the 30s, during the 30s, that country was heavily hit by poachers looking for the white oak staves. But what I was going to tell you though was that the Dierks Lumber and Coal Company went into bankruptcy. They took federal bankruptcy some way. And there was a receiver appointed who was to try to keep it together, kind of like this Chapter 11 bankruptcy thing that's going on
What
now.
year was that?
Must have been 32, 33, somewhere in there. And they let Dierks continue to operate, trying to maybe come out of it. But when the white oak timber thing became popular, they found that they had, on the north slopes of all these hills, they had white oak that had never been cut. Never been even reported, see, it wasn't even considered anything they wanted. In a period of a year or two.
$2 million.
Yeah, in those days, that was something.
Did that
And
save
it
the
bailed them
company?
out.
That's what saved Dierks.
Yeah,
Cutting
really did.
white oak for
Mhm.
bourbon
Mhm.
staves.
And between what, I didn't know too much about the Arkansas situation, but I do know that when I was cruising, I'd find, when I'd cross over the top of a ridge and start down the north slopes, I'd find these staves laying on the ground, still there. This was in the 50s. White oak, good hardwood white oak is something.
Now what,
But it was bourbon staves they were after, and we called a good white, Quercus alba, bourbon stave white oak. We still do it.
now your post oak, now that's a white oak.
It's a
Is
white
that-
oak, yeah, but it's
Yeah.
not. And it can be used. Some certain strains of it can. You know,
Yeah, just a
there's
plain old white oak. Quercus alba is the best one.
yeah, that's what some people call the forked leaf white oak.
Yeah.
It's got the deep
Right.
lobes in the leaves, and it's got a nice flaky white bark or light colored bark. The post oak is, while it's a white oak and closely related, it developed, I think, out of the white oak, and it was adaptable to become adaptable to droughty situations.
Because I'm from
soils.
Bartlesville, the Osage Hills. We have lots of post oak up there, and they seem to, I don't think they're straight, and they're awfully,
Well, it's kind of like the post oak and the blackjack
yeah.
are two, the blackjack springing off of the red oak family.
Yeah.
It's nearly impossible to use it for anything.
Well, we call blackjack scrub oak. You know, it's not good for anything.
You want to go out and get us something to eat?
Yeah. About timber poaching in Indian Territory.
During Indian Territory Day?
Yeah.
No, I really don't know. I know there's signs. You can see signs of it.
Yeah.
Especially up in the Baptiste area.
Yeah.
All of the old virgin pine trees would have a face on them, where they had took their axes and examined the grain. If the grain was straight enough to make boards, and I'm talking about really logs almost. You know, they'd split and hew out these straight boards and build their Choctaw cabins. And you can still find them.
Yeah.
Made of those.
Because we have records, and people from Arkansas and Texas are coming cutting the big hardwoods, and they're shipping to Germany. This is a lot of the furniture in Germany built 1870, 80, and 90 came from wood, from Oklahoma.
No,
And
no, I'm not familiar with that. I know it was just a way of life
yeah.
here that all this Indian land and all of Dierks' land holdings were pretty much fair game.
Did Dierks build camp houses for the people?
Yeah. Bright City was just a company town.
What was the normal camp house like?
Just
built?
shotgun.
The shotgun house?
Shotgun. Maybe one big room, sometimes two rooms.
Any of those houses left?
Yeah. Around Wright City, you'll see them. Then in Broken Bow, they built some four-room houses. In the area they call White City, which is the southwestern part of town. It came up to Highway 70, 259. That was the border of it. And there was a bunch of shotgun houses over and back on the east side of the mill, where the blacks lived. And when I came over, I rented one of those. I lived in it for several year or two, and then built a house.
What is the worst fire you ever fought?
Oh gosh, I can't remember any outstanding fires. The thing about them was some of them were big, but those fires in those days were intentionally set to do something, and generally they picked a time when it didn't do all the damage that happens now. Now, the fires we're having now are pretty much, well, they're arson. They're intentional arson. Well, those fires were done by the natives to help their deer hunting, poaching, and supposedly to eradicate ticks and to bring on early grass. And they were more or less almost controlled birds. They'd set them in such a way that they didn't really kill a big. They never. Very seldom would you see a crown fire.
Yeah.
Now they can get them, especially in 10-year-old, 15-year-old plantations. They'll crown, and they've had some fires in the last 5 years that I would have hated to been assigned to. We just didn't have them that bad.
Right. You left Dierks in 60?
1960.
What'd you do then?
Well, my neighbor had this hardwood mill, and that was his son.
Oh,
that you
yeah, okay.
saw out here on the street, Don Dugan. And he was from a Memphis family. That was, Memphis hardwood, kind of a hardwood center, was a hardwood center. And this young man built a mill here in 1926 on that same site. Although it was in that picture, it was on the upper right-hand corner. It was of that 17 acres. It burned in 52, I guess it was, and he built the mill back that I bought. Well, he died in 58. Ross died in 58. And the mill was just shut down. Don was just a baby. And Ms. Dugan tried to sell it. Nobody was interested in it. The banks wanted to see that payroll back. It was a pretty good payroll. And they approached me about they would help finance me if I would leave Dierks and try it. So I did.
Mm-hmm.
And I bought that mill and opened it October of '60. And ran it until '71. And I could see the OSHA thing hitting me, and one of the worst things I did was modernize the mill. He had one of the first grateless furnaces for his boiler.
What kind of furnace?
Grateless. It was just
okay.
burning, wood would burn just on the floor of the furnace part of the boiler. And he fed it with all the waste wood, all the sawdust, all the slabs, as they would go out, come off the head rig, went through a cut-up saw. We'd just cut it up, swing saw.
Yeah.
We'd just cut it up into stove wood almost.
What's a swing saw?
Well, it's a big circle saw that's mounted from the ceiling, and you can just push it through the, you know, just like some of these people do now with commercializing the making of firewood.
Yeah.
You know, slasher, they call them, slasher saw. Anyway, but it was cut up and went on a conveyor and dropped into this grateless furnace. And the sawdust and small pieces never would even hit the fire, you know, hit the bottom. You get that thing white hot, and it would burn that stuff and never be any smoke come out the stack. We'd start at about 4 in the morning, get it good and hot. So when the mill started, and then we ran the whole mill on steam. I had only 5 horsepower of electrical motors in that swing saw, and the cutoff saw was all. It was electricity I used. All the rest was steam.
Was it powered by that stove?
It had a steam engine.
Yeah.
Remember that old steam engine?
Mm-hmm.
It was a twin 12-inch to 12-inch cylinders.
And you heated the water with that grateless stove?
And it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd use about 2,000 gallons an hour of water through that boiler. It was an old Erie City boiler. And but all of this waste would go up through the tubes. It was a water tube boiler, and they'd go up. You'd see them just go up through, and they'd be consumed before they ever got to the stack. And especially the hardwoods like oak and hickory, they'd burn ash and those things burn real well, and you'd mix. If you had a cottonwood log, you just mixed it.
Yeah.
Or a cypress log, you'd mix it in. And when the paper business came to us, the Ashdown mill, say at Nacousas, I put in about $100,000 worth of equipment to make chips for them, and it made a great money situation as far as what they call it, cash flow. It was great. I was handling lots of money, but I wasn't making as much because I was paying interest on the equipment, and the equipment was depreciating. So, but I over-modernized. Went to gas in that furnace, and took all that out, you know, and shoot. That operation would have been a showplace now.
Yeah. That's right.
It was a little bit labor oriented. It took more people.
Mm-hmm.
But if you'd add up even the advances in the hourly costs, say, of labor, it would still have been better economics.
Yeah, right. Well, you're producing your own power, basically.
Yeah.
How come Dierks sold that to Weyerhauser?
Well, it was kind of touch and go. I think if Weyerhauser hadn't bought Dierks would have bought Weyerhauser. It was that close.
Yeah, it was.
it was one of those things that they both needed to do or get out. And it was very similar, in my opinion, to what happened to Crossett. The family had gotten big. The stock was spread among more and more people that didn't care anything about the lumber business. In fact, as the Watzik family and there's another family connected with Crossett, they lived in Chicago and never had come. And old Pete Watzik had to run it. Well, he was running it for a very small share of the total profits, and he was wearing himself out. The same thing happened to Pete George. Pete George was running all that, taking all the responsibility, and most of the Dierks were scattered around Kansas City. Sutherland is married to Dierks. You know, the Sutherland lumber yards.
Yeah, right.
So that they're Dierks oriented, but it was all these stockholders that Pete was, and I think Pete was tired. And the young Dierks that would have maybe made it possible for them to acquire Weyerhauser was killed in an auto accident about that time, and I think Pete just said, well, let's do it. And he's just, young Fred was more, he was an engineer, an MIT engineer, and he wasn't interested. He loved equipment, but he didn't enjoy the lumber business that much. So Pete ended up having to carry the whole load, make all the decisions, and I think he got tired too.
What about the Choctaws in this area? I've always heard rumors they don't like outsiders. The old Choctaws down here.
That group that we were talking at lunch about being against the move from Mississippi, that about half the tribe
Yeah.
are and still are leery of the white man.
And they're called snakes.
Well, I've heard them. I've heard one Choctaw say about the other side, that's the Snake Indians, you know.
How can
But
you call them snakes?
I don't know. I have no idea. But then there are the group that are very, very friendly. They were badly taken advantage of. If I were a Choctaw, I think I'd have gone on a rebellion. And it wasn't against the local whites. It was more against the government of the United States through the Department of Indian Affairs.
Right.
There was much bad judgment, maybe crooked bureaucrats involved, because there was too many. For instance, why would they let an Indian sell his timber with no supervision? A man could go contact an Indian about his timber on maybe his 160 acres and buy it for a song, because the Indian didn't understand it. Their society, was originally was all this is all of ours.
Yeah.
They place no value on property. The original Choctaw was from a culture that beat what we've got. Their good name was what they thought a lot of. And that was the only thing they put a real value on. And they were a little trusting. And Bureau of Indian Affairs but they'd let him sell his timber. Then when he wanted to sell his land, they had to give permission. And his land was then worthless, because the timber value was the only value that was there. So then they turned, the Bureau and and Congress turned around in 29, I think it was, and said that except for the homestead, all this allotted land was going to be taxable. Beyond the actual homestead.
Right.
Well, shoot, it wasn't worth anything. There wasn't anything left there, and they couldn't sell it. So they just let it go for taxes. And they got robbed that way too.
Yeah,
you know.
right.
We took, I'll tell you what, the American government has never been all it should have been. And I don't blame Cherokees for fighting the Arkansas riverbed oil deal at all. And I think someday it's liable to happen on the red, because the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek gave the Choctaw to the South Bank. And there's been many a court case to determine where that South Bank was in 1832. They resurveyed it in 1929, I think it was, or somewhere. And that was never allotted when they surveyed and set up the lands to be allotted. Of course, that had no value. So those old riverbeds have never been allotted. Some of them are in farms now, but they actually legally are still tribal. Because it was tribal land and never allotted.
Yeah. Oh.
And Muskogee has never made an issue of it. They've never tried to protect it. In fact, if they find something that can be sold, they sell it. Down in the corner of the state, there was a big cutoff happened way back there, but after 1832. And there was this couple thousand acres of wilderness between an old lake that was where the river was in 1832 and where it is now. It was called John Tom Island. And it was some of the prettiest, ecologically, it was the virgin timber of the bottomlands, the only one I ever saw. With walnut, 4 foot in diameter on it, and the soils were ecologically old. Walnut will grow on new ecological soil, and cherry and all these fine hardwoods. And they just put it up for bids. A doctor in Tulsa bought it. After they sold me the timber on it, on a bid. And we cut some beautiful timber off of that. Had to go in from Texas. It's on the Texas side of the river.
Right.
Well,
But I talked to the tribe. I even went to the chief, Durant, and sat down and talked with him. I didn't want to cut it. I wanted them to keep it as something the tribe could have, if nothing else, a sanctuary. If you talk about game, the old river formed a lake on the south boundary of it, so there was very little access. And the lake was, I figured up, was something over 200 acres surface. It was rather narrow, but it was a deep lake. And of course the river on the north. And here was this amount of land that I saw deer. I wanted to go in there, just like, just primeval.
they wouldn't go for it? How come?
They wanted to get rid of it.
Hmm?
They wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to.
Why?
They didn't want to bother with it. I even talked to my brother, who was in the Fish and Wildlife Service, about what a great place it'd be for a game preserve. Not a game preserve, but a duck. It was swampy lands, that lake for ducks, and all that mast, you know, in the woods with big oak trees. They just didn't want to fool with it. Fish and Wildlife Service got, you know, after I talked to him, he got a hold of the man in Tulsa, and he came down and looked at it, and he thought it somehow that the tribe ought to keep it. They would manage it for him, you know, and so on. But the chief over at Durant just
Is that wrong?
gave me one before him.
Oh, okay.
He just
So
gave
did
me
you
a
cut the
turtle.
timber?
Mhm. Beautiful logs.
Mm-hmm.
I cut the timber on the off the game preserve too. That was an open bid thing, and I ended up on that little narrow strip of bottoms. It was the only pure stand of holly I've ever seen. One spot, about 10 acres of it, just pure holly, all sawlog size. I had shown it to my old professor from Michigan. Came down. I had written up there in conversation with him and told him about this holly, and he came down to see it. And he said that was the largest. He was a holly nut. He said that's the largest. Was the largest stand he'd ever seen of pure holly.
Is it still there?
Yes, no, it's underwater from the lake. But I cut that. It was going to be flooded, and it was virgin red gum and basswood. You wouldn't believe. And basswood's a funny one. It sounds hollow when it isn't. You know, when I cruised it to bid on the thing, I'd bang it with an axe, you know, side of an axe, and see if it'd sound like a drum. And they'd all sound like drums. And they were all. I shipped a whole carload to Wisconsin, where it was used in their furniture bid. And they'd never heard of getting any basswood in Chile Americana. Never heard of getting that from down here. They also didn't believe that we had good maple. All the southern maple's wormy. On the Little River it's not, because we got sugar maple on it. If we just had the winter's spring, I mean, like they do in Massachusetts, we could make maple syrup. You know that.
What kind of spring does it take?
Cold nights, warm days. When the sap, you know, that gets the sap going in the north. Usually there's snow still on the ground when they're maple sugaring, you know.
Right.
But we have 3 or 4 species of maple, and something about Little River Bottom that it grows well. All the species grow well there, and they're beautiful. Even bird's eye.
Trying to think anything else. What haven't we covered?
I don't know. I'm having a good time just visiting. I'm glad you're doing something like this, or somebody is. Who did you need to call? And
Oh, I need to call.
always wished I could speak Choctaw, because I was dealing, you know, I'd run into them in the woods, and it would have been fun to just been able to sit on a log and talk to them. So I took this course in Choctaw language. I still got all the stuff over on my desk. I ran into it the other day, but I learned about 100 words. You know, I could use about 100 words and put them together pretty well. But some of the older Choctaws helped put it on. And the funny thing was, the class was made up of about half of young Choctaws. They didn't know Choctaw, and they were proud of it. You know. Years ago, I was told this by one of the Indians that for many years they didn't want their children speaking Choctaw.
Yeah, right.
They were not proud of their tribe or their language. And then all of a sudden, because of people like you, they and a few of them that didn't want to lose the heritage, they began to get interested in these kids. They weren't the best students either.
Yeah.
Funny thing.
Who,
But they wouldn't speak Choctaw in the home.
any of those Choctaw still living that know the language well that would do an interview about the Choctaw language?
I tell you a fellow that that helped with that, Charlie Jones.
Charlie Jones.
And I see him once in a while. I think he's retired. He was with one of the government agencies.
Is he Choctaw?
Yeah.
Would he happen to
Charlie
be?
Jones, I believe that's his name.
Would he be related to old Colonel R.M. Jones?
Possibly.
You know who he is, Colonel
No.
Jones. He was a Choctaw that came from Mississippi, and when he came here, he brought 500 slaves with him. He was the richest Choctaw in the Choctaw Nation.
Oh.
And he had the big mansion at the park at Rose Hill, here at the Choctaw Nation. Because he was born in the Civil War. And I'm trying to find some Choctaw freedmen that were brought, or their descendants that were brought with Jones over here. Because if he had 500 slaves, there must be lots of descendants.
Yeah, I think there's a colony. See, a lot of the freedmen land was South Broken Bow, edge of Little River Bottoms. I think the Burris blacks are descendants of the freedmen, and several other families. But let's see, Arthel Burris. He lives in a nice home just south of where Yashaw Creek crosses Highway 259. White brick home. He works for the highway department. And he worked for me at the mill. He's a real handsome black man.
Do you know how to contact Charlie Jones?
No, I was just trying to think. Dave Canadaby could probably tell us how to. Another one was the Taffy family, black, that were freedmen. Johnny T-A-A-F-F-E-E. You know, so many of the blacks who were freed took the name of the family, you know, and the Taft family, they call it Taft, the white side of it. Now, Francis is a lawyer here. His father helped survey this country in 1898.
The Dawes Commission?
I've seen his name on the old plats. And I have.
Also, I need to check with the courthouse to see, was Idabel a recording area in Indian Territory? Because you had the federal courts at Muskogee, McAllister, and Ardmore. They were the three main areas, and they had recording districts. And they had 27...
They talk about, in abstracts, they talk about the Antlers records, which predate statehood. And that courthouse burned, remember? And I think they may have saved enough from, or rebuilt it from the abstract companies in Antlers. But as I understand it, you can't have a licensed abstract company that doesn't have a copy of those before statehood records. And they call it the Antlers record for some reason.
because I know there were 27 recording districts. Because it was first set up, the federal court was Fort Smith for all of Indian Territory. Then they had the 3 districts of Muskogee, McAllister, and Ardmore. Then they set up 27 recording districts. So if you lived here, instead of going to McAllister, they had a recording district.
I think it was Antlers probably.
Okay, and
Pushed Mataha courthouse.
I wonder if was Idabel a recording district?
I don't think so.
They had 27 of them.
No, I don't think so. Because
Yeah.
that's why we have to go to the Antlers record
Yeah.
for that pre-state.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because I know, Marietta, south of Ardmore, was a recording district.
Mhm.
That was just a few miles, and they had Marietta. Then.
I think Bush
Yeah.
County was
Mhm.
Antlers was it.
There is another guy I wish I'd contact. He turned me down for an interview this morning, and his name is Harrison Mooney.
Harrison Mooney?
You know him?
Yeah,
Okay.
we were just down the street from him.
Yeah. The reason I know him, his son lives in Bartlesville,
Oh,
and I know his son Charlie Mooney real well.
well, I'll bet.
And
He's a nice fella.
oh yeah.
Harrison.
And then,
but he didn't want to.
well, my folks know Charlie, and he knows my folks. So I said, I'm coming down here. The folks said, well, call Harrison Mooney. He's a friend of ours. So I called him. And he said, there's more people know more than I do. He said, go talk to them. They know more. But he built the DeQueen plant.
Yeah.
And I want to get him on tape, but he's a little hesitant.
Well, he was in the construction with the Dierks company for
Yeah.
years and years. And he's a real fine neighbor.
Oh, very nice man. And he just
helps,
said,
since he's retired, he's helped everybody in that neighborhood anytime they want
yep.
to improve
He
the
said
house.
there's people that know more than I do. He said, yeah, go talk to John. He knows more than I do. But I want to talk to him again to see if I can't talk him into it.
Yeah.
And then
He could tell you a lot of the history of the building that Dierks did.
well, that's what we want. And
See, they had this. Dierks had this engineer that from MIT that they somehow got, and he was a fine design engineer. Joe Clarkson. And I guess Joe's dead. I don't know. But he was a brilliant, very brilliant mill design engineer. And actually what Harrison Mooney did and the other people in that crew was to just follow what he wanted done. A lot of them couldn't read a blueprint, but they learned how to interpret Joe, what he wanted, and they built some real fine mills.
yeah. Well,
You might be able to get a hold, the state highway barn is just off the west bypass south of Holiday Inn, as you go around that bypass. You might be able to get a hold of that Burris
okay.
through that office.
Yeah. I need to go. That's why I was supposed to go get gas. Yeah, I'm in a state car.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to go to the highway barns to get gas.
Oh.
It's cheaper for state vehicles that way. Besides, I don't have to pay for it that way.
Sure. Grove, and way back in there, and Jay and all, that was heavily forested
Yeah.
with the Ozark species
That's
at
right.
one time.
Well, my family is all from northwest Arkansas, so we used to travel back and forth quite a
Is
bit.
that right?
Stuff around Rogers.
Oh, yeah. I spent my honeymoon in Rogers.
You did.
Yeah. My first wife died, but
Mm-hmm.
46.
Excuse me, this is Charles O'Leary's on the phone.
Oh,
Do you want
okay.
I'll get my hat.
Yes.
Well, sir, I want to thank you for the interview.